Now I'm going to turn it over to David Monk, who has been gathering questions. And are you ready, David?
Yes, I'm ready. There are a lot of good questions. So I'm trying to combine some of them. And what I'm going to suggest is that I'll direct them to one of the presenters. And if the other panelist presenters have something to add, please do. But it'd be great if we could get through as many questions as possible, okay? Okay, so there's a couple of questions here, and this is for Chief Heppel. There's questions about the warnings that were provided up the McKenzie. It sounded like, according to the folks who are asking these questions, they recognize that the high winds were anticipated, and they're wondering if there's any lessons learned from the fire to establish red flag wind warnings even prior to ignition of fires, so that people can begin to prepare themselves. And if you're all are thinking about improvements to your communication and early warning system to make sure that neighbors aren't counting on neighbors in this kind of event.
Yeah. So great question. I think that was, I'm following along the questions here with, it looks like Randy Prince's questions here with the issues of no evacuation orders. And so it's a tenuous situation. You know, you could say these things are going on, but we're not going to initiate evacuation orders when there's not a threat per se. All we can do is inform. And while you may look at whether it's the state or the county or the city to provide those early warnings, actually we have a tremendous amount of early warning indications through other agencies such as NOAA, as well as AccuWeather, etc., that advise community members that these events are going to start to transpire or these events can happen. And I would encourage our community members to be well informed. When we get into fire season, be aware of what's going on. What is our, what's going on in the community in terms of fuel moistures? What's the weather looking like? I can tell you for us, it's the eastern winds that are going to be a problem. Our normal winds from the north have moisture in them, etc. So we do have, well, it's not specifically alerting systems from the community or the county or the city, etc. There are so many, there are many organizations out there that let us know about red flag warnings and weather systems, etc., that we need to be aware of. If there are things that are truly a threat to the community, we do have an alert system in place, which you can subscribe to. And so if you go to the Lane County Emergency Management website, you can subscribe to that. And you're going to get those warnings early on. So those warnings were pushed out pretty early with regards to the holiday farm fire. It wasn't that there was a fire threat, but it was in terms of a red flag warning as well as high winds, etc. And many of those warnings were in place and precipitated well before that actual event occurred, just to give an early warning as to what's going on. So that's what I would recommend to folks, is to subscribe to many of those types of programs and the early alert or warning systems and weather systems, and stay engaged with what's going on in our environment and in our community.
Thank you, sir. Okay, I've got one for Deputy Chief Linder. One of our participants said he's looked at after action reports in California, and apparently narrow roads was a major concern for firefighters having access to the areas in need of their attention. And this participant is curious whether the Fire Marshal's office is advising the city of Eugene and communities around the state, given our House Bill 2001 requiring every large community to allow more dense development. what is the concerns of the fire marshal's office, and are you consulting with the city on how they might address those narrow streets given the kind of density that is coming our way?
That is a great question. I did talk a lot about access and egress, and this is a quite complicated question, or a quite complicated answer, unfortunately. So the challenge that we have is, we have a lot of existing roads that are already narrow and steep. It's very difficult to go back and change in a drastic format our existing road and infrastructure. It is certainly a concern of the fire department and the fire marshal's office, and it is something that my team looks at in the planning and development phases. But where I talked a lot about the importance of coordination and collaboration, that takes time and energy getting the right people in the room. And there are some areas where we have state law, local code, fire code, development code, public works, road standards that aren't all in coordination with each other. And so that makes some challenges when it comes to development. So we certainly raise our concerns and advocate for things that impact our ability to access in an emergency situation, and things that will impact egress. But it is a collaboration and a balance of priorities when it comes to development and density and existing areas and what we have already, and not putting undue hardship on developers that are adding on to existing development. So it's a complicated network of trying to find the right balance, but we are certainly aware, and we do have some areas of town that are of concern, and we do work with our development staff, our building staff, public works, and have those conversations at any opportunity that we can.
Excellent, thank you. Tim, I've heard this from other sources, so you're I think the best position to respond to this. This participant asks, what percentage of the acreage burned in the Holiday Farm fire was monoculture tree farms, and whether these clear-cut, well, the tree farms, the replanted tree farms, are contributing to the intensity of the forest fires?
Yeah, it's a great question. On the Holiday Farm fire, well, I encourage folks to go to our website, FUSEE.org, and in the spot fire section, it's our blog, we have a number of essays and analyses that really look at the Holiday Farm fire. And I'm not a numbers person, they don't stick in my head, but in excess of 70% of the area within the Holiday Farm fire was private lands. And a majority of that was corporate owned, timberlands. And a majority of that was plantations of various ages. So it was a significant portion of the Holiday Farm fire was in, industrial forest zone. So the thing about these timber plantations is they are highly flammable when they're young trees. The most flammable portion of a conifer is its massive needles. And young trees, densely planted, have those branches right down to the ground, they're very flammable. Even a moderate intensity fire can crown out very, very quickly. On those steep slopes with no big trees to kind of repel the wind or the sun, they can face hot, dry winds, and of the same age, the fire can spread very rapidly. And that was a phenomenon, not just the Holiday Farm fire, but all these fires was the phenomenal rate of spread. So the Holiday Farm fire, I think, provides a good example of this claim that it's the lack of forest management, i.e. logging, that is part of why these fires are burning and what's put homes and communities at risk. At least with the Holiday Farm fire, is just the opposite. Perhaps too much logging of the wrong kind in the wrong places. If it didn't, well, it didn't help, let's say that, protect those communities from the firestorm that's rolling right through the valley bottom.
Great, thank you, Tim. Okay, let's see, Chief Heppel, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to combine a couple of questions. One was what initiated or caused the Holiday Farm fire? And I had heard that it was a down power line. If that's not the case, please respond. The other question was, given the maybe 24, 48 hours of high wind warnings we were receiving prior to the fire getting started, why weren't the power lines shut down? And is that something that you all are looking at again for lessons learned from this fire? And how would you advocate this system changing to prevent that from happening in the future?
Wow, two great questions. So I'm just a reminder that the fire was not in our area jurisdiction. That was actually in the U.S. Forest Service in terms of the ignition source. So I'm not sure if they have completed their investigation as to what was the source of the fire. And I don't want to be subjective in that piece or make a presumption. So I'll leave it to that piece. However, power lines have been clearly a source of ignition for many of these fires. If you look at the campfire, for example, down in California, and a number of other fires, infrastructure or failure to maintain that electrical infrastructure have been a contributing factor to those events. I will say that we actually had, it's interesting, we actually had a number of conversations with organizations such as eWeb, Lane Electric, EPUD, et cetera. We had those conversations as to what would be our trigger points to where we would shut down power to communities based on the wind and the weather patterns that we were experiencing. But please recognize that is a challenge that's associated with that. Locally, it can be a little bit easier if they can manage those shutdowns, but please recognize when we're making the decision to shut down power to communities, we're shutting down power not to everyone. And so we have folks as a paramedic at heart. When I shut down the power to a community, let's remember those patients that are on oxygen, condensers, et cetera, they start losing power to those things. Folks that are dependent on that, they lose that dependence. And so, we struggle with that balance of, the need of the perception that it could potentially start a fire versus those that are in need of that power source on a regular basis. So those conversations did transpire, and we had some trigger points, et cetera, certainly within the lower end of the Willamette Valley. With regards to when you start going upriver, those power lines, which potentially could have started it, that I think folks are focusing on, are transfer power lines. So those are power lines that are sending power from the Columbia River Gorge to Southern Oregon. So when we start talking about shutting down those transfer power lines, you're talking about shutting down power to those communities for thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. And so those are many of the situations that we're placed in where we have to exercise risk versus benefit perspective. I can't speak for those with the BPA and Bonneville and whatever power lines up there, but I can tell you within the Eugene, Springfield area, we absolutely had those conversations with the eWeb, EPUD, et cetera, to shut those down if we needed to prevent those events from transpiring. So wish I had a better answer to that, but it's a balance of risk benefit in the end, and recognizing there's a potential risk of keeping things energized, and there's also a risk of de-energizing those power lines as well.
David, could I answer some of that too?
Of course.
Yeah. Well, it may be still a bit of a unknown what was the ignition source of the Holiday Farm fire. Other fires, it was clear that it was power lines. The fires in the Sandiam Canyon, clearly over a dozen power lines failed. ignited fires right within the community of Gates, including a power line that came down and ignited the incident command post for the Beachy Creek fire. Hundreds of firefighters had a fire ignite right in their camp, and they had to evacuate, and it was a complete disaster. I mean, that if anywhere you want a fire, here's hundreds of crews ready and able. But again, dealing with electric fires, that was my greatest fear as a wildland firefighter, being anywhere near power lines. In California, it's absolutely clear the link between power line ignitions and large wildfires. In California, then, they have so much more potential for solar, rooftop solar power. And to the best of my knowledge, we've never had a wildfire ignited by a rooftop solar panel. So thinking in terms of how do we address the climate crisis with maybe decentralized energy grids and systems, more renewable energy sources like solar, that's a twofer. You know, getting rid of these power lines from, you know, fossil fuel JIP plants located far away, more rooftop solar, more decentralized power grids. That addresses both crises simultaneously. We should be thinking, you know, in big in those kind of terms, where they're have potential.
Good, thank you, Tim. Okay, I'm combining a couple. This is for Deputy Chief Linder. Given the obviously the changing climate, this participant's asking, you know, given this new normal, what different preparations and policies are you all undertaking and advocating for with our governing jurisdictions? And then also, another participant saw some drone footage of the fire in Talent, and that was clearly in a non-forested area. And here we are talking about, and you mentioned it, a couple of y'all did, about that it's not only wildland urban interface, right? And so this participant was asking about the northwest part of our community, where we have farmlands, grass fields, summertime northern winds. Would the embers be as intense and intense enough to blow the fire into the metro area? And again, if that's our new normal, what policy changes are you all looking for?
So great questions. So I'm going to start with the second question first, and it's important to think about all fuel. So not just trees and forest, but absolutely grasslands. They burn differently. So it's important to understand the differences in fuel types. When we look at sort of the campfire analogy I used and the different levels of fuel, typically our grassy and lower fuels are more flashy. They burn quicker, they move through quicker, they're not as intense, but they certainly get embers going. And if they certainly burn right up to a structure, they can certainly cause ignition. So no matter whether that's within the urban core, if that's on the northwest side of town with farmlands, or in the south part of town where we have more forested lands. I grew up in central Washington. Our main fuel was more brushy, not forest trees, but a lot more brush material, and still a significant wildfire problem. So it's important to know the type of fuel, and the same principles of defensible space are important no matter where in the community. In terms of what we're doing in terms of policy and moving forward, it's a difficult conversation. We have a very diverse community and very diverse points of view on how much regulation is tolerable in terms of regulating how we build and where we build and what requirements are placed on individual property owners. And so it's balancing that conversation with the overall needs for safety. When it comes to codes and legislation, it takes a while for those processes to catch up, and they're usually in response to some kind of an event. So we're looking at this as a teachable moment where it's on everybody's minds. It's closer than it's ever been here in our area. So it's an opportunity to say, here are some things we can do. There was some code language passed, and it's optional language that was put into the code that's available for adoption at the local level within the residential building code. There's several steps that have to be approved before that can be enacted. Medford, Ashland, those are some places that have looked at that already. I'm beginning to have those conversations with both of our building departments and planning departments in Eugene and Springfield. It's a collaborative approach between planning, building, and fire about what that looks like, how we balance that approach, and come up with recommendations and proposals to bring forward. But those conversations are starting.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, Tim, there's I have a participant that's a resident of California going to school here at the U of O, and they're having an issue with a school that's rebuilding, and it's apparently, perhaps in California, they're able to exempt themselves from the requirements for defensible space. They live adjacent to the school, so they're exceedingly worried about that. And I'm going to combine this with another, because you spoke to it, working with, as did Deputy Chief Linder, working with your nearby neighbors, because in a community where we have 5-foot setbacks, how do we accomplish that true defensible space? We only really do that by working with our neighbors. So what would you advise folks who perhaps have neighbors that have been unresponsive to their requests, that they, and I've actually talked to a neighbor who offered to pay to have professionals come in and do it, and the neighbors still weren't interested. They're a home HOA. So how would you advise neighbors to work together to create as much defensible space as possible?
Yeah, well, in terms of the first question, that's an issue we're dealing right now. I mean, the city of Blue River, folks are committed to being in the community there and rebuilding. And the question is, how are they going to rebuild? And because I'm arguing this was not just this was an extreme event, but it may not be so rare in our future. We may be seeing more frequent fires and conditions of this type, so need to build back better in a way that is, increases the probability that they will survive a future fire, or they won't really need firefighters risking their lives to defend those homes. So that's something that I know in California is a huge homeless crisis. There's a homeless crisis here in Oregon, and a lot of pressure to rebuild structures and homes quickly, cheaply, but don't throw more good money after bad, pretending that we can just do business as usual. We need to rebuild smarter with fire in mind. Now, in terms of rallying your neighbors, I'd say that the effort first is to start these discussions amongst neighbors and with the neighborhood association groups here, including fire along with earthquakes and who knows, floods too, as something to prepare for. And start with the people who really desire some work but lack the capacity. And I know in my neighborhood, I have a lot of elderly people, I have disabled people. They need help. And so, trying to organize, particularly young people who've got the backs that can do some of this kind of work of helping defensible space. That's where you start. And I think once you've demonstrated that we can live in dwellings prepared for natural disturbances, ways that prevent them becoming natural disasters, and still have our privacy, still have beauty. I'm hoping that will entice those other neighbors to get on board, with the rest of the community. Ideally, we should set up a system of incentives. And there again, in terms of community solutions, let's put pressure on our policymakers, get us the resources to make that happen. And tax breaks or whatever, incentives to help this work happen. But perhaps it also, as the fire marshal noted, needs some mandates. Like, it has to happen because one home can put the rest of the neighborhood, rest of the community at risk. And it's beyond private property rights. There's also issue community responsibilities.
Excellent, thanks.
And Dave, I'd like to jump in on that one just to
Please,
take on
yes.
where Tim was going there. You mentioned HOAs came up in that initial piece of the question, and that's an important piece of the conversation. Is it's a really good time as these conversations are happening to revisit the rules of your homeowners association, and if there are any restrictive covenants in place, and those have worked both in favor and against this particular issue. We've been contacted in the fire marshal's office for people wanting to do defensible space, wanting to remove some trees, wanting to do some limbing, and it was in violation of their homeowners association rules. And we actually had to provide a letter on letterhead with recommendations of what to be done on that property before they could even do anything in fear of their HOA. And on the flip side, it's also an opportunity that HOAs can perhaps move quicker than we can with codes and legislation to begin some of that work, creating your own pieces that if people want to live in your neighborhood, your geographic area, then they have to abide by these rules, and fire safety can also be a part of that.
Thank you. I'm so glad you addressed that, the HOA. Let's see, Chief Heppel, this comes from a participant who came from California, and she wasn't sure if she misheard you. And this is the level 1, 2, 3 warnings, evacuation warnings. She was suggesting that 1 is the get ready, ready, set, go. 1 is ready, 2 is set, 3 is go. And she was unsure whether that's what you said or was 3 set, 2 go, ready, set, go. Excuse me, 1 go. Could you clarify that, please, so that we all know exactly what that level 1, 2, 3 means?
Chief Heppel, you're muted.
I'll tell you what, I'll go to Deputy Chief Linder again real quick here. So one questioner has gone up the McKinsey, driven up. She's I think a Eugene resident, and she noticed, and I've actually been up there as well, and noticed where one house, a lot of the surrounding vegetation was burned down to the ground. The neighboring houses, in many cases, were totally destroyed, and yet this house stands almost unblemished. And in some cases, there was hardy siding. Some cases, I saw metal roofs seem to survive more. But can you speak to that question of the whether it's purely the building materials that saved these homes, or was it luck and changing wind conditions? How would you respond to that question?
I think I would say it's all of the above and a lot of things we don't know. Not having been up there and being able to look at those structures prior to the fire event, I don't know what their condition was beforehand in comparison to the one that's standing or not standing. So I would be remiss into trying to speak to individual structures in that area. So it's certainly fire conditions. You can do all of the right things and still with the changing winds and the particular fire conditions still have an ignition. So it's doing all the right things and having luck on your side.
It's also possible that the actions of fire crews also help save that house, and particularly, I mean, I think there was barely 30 firefighters, confronting, the onset of the Holiday Farm fire. And at that scale of the fire, you're doing triage, and you're just kind of marking out what homes are absolutely indefensible, what homes need a little bit of work to defend, what homes you can count on. Hey, they're good on their own. You want to do your share of work before that first whiff of smoke to make your house very appealing to be defended if necessary, or not even require that. So that's possible too. Why some of those homes survived where their neighbors didn't.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Chief
I can
Heppel?
check in, Tom, if you like. Sorry.
No, go ahead. And if you would clarify the level 1, 2, 3 for us as well.
Yeah, so I may have got it backwards, and I apologize if I did. But level 1 is the ready. You know, get yourself ready, bring things together, put things that are of meaning to you and your family, etc., in a position in which you're ready to evacuate. Level 2 is be set. So that's ready, set. It's you need to be actively monitoring the communication resource that's going to tell you to leave your community. So when the level 3 go is initiated, you're actually going out the door. And one of the challenges we experienced with the holiday farm fire is there was no level 1 or 2. It was 3 and go.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge that was associated with that. And it's as one of the folks who was intimately involved with this from the first night through the first 2 weeks, and in the incident command structure, it was why didn't we get a 1 and a 2 and a 3? And I would say reflect back, get a map, and say, wow, a fire traveled 20 miles in 15 hours. And that is just unbelievable. It's just unsubstantiated. Not only that, it was within the McKenzie River Valley, which is, it's a lot of green trees. They shouldn't burn. The McKenzie River is right there, which is a lot of humidity. It shouldn't burn. It shouldn't do these kinds of things, And as I sit here and I say this, I look at Tim as the ecologist shaking his head going, yeah, you're right. It probably shouldn't have burned. But when we have vegetation burning down to the edge of the McKenzie River, that tells us we were in a condition that it was unprecedented. And whatever precipitated that, I have to maintain a relative neutral position as the fire chief of my organization, in the sense of, was it global climate? Was it the environmental conditions? Was it these things? I don't know. But the fact is, there was ivy burning within 3 inches of the McKenzie River, which is radiating humidity. Folks, that shouldn't have happened. It should not have happened. I mean, from all extensive purposes, that shouldn't have happened. But unfortunately, that's what we experienced that night. So that combination of those winds ripping down the valley at 30 to 40 plus miles an hour, throwing the firebrands half mile ahead of the leading edge of the fire for 15 plus hours, burned 20 miles and 73,000 acres. That was the reality that we experienced. And this should be, for me as the fire chief of Eugene Springfield Fire, the reality for me was it can happen here. And I'm intimately involved with the wildland community. I'm on the incident management teams. I go out and do these things annually for years and years and years. The interesting part is, if those weather conditions would have continued for another 24 to 36 hours, we would have been fighting this fire in the South Hills of Eugene. It would have jumped the hill down into Lorain. It would have moved its way up through Pleasant Hill, Lorain, Dexter, Pleasant Hill, and it would have quickly jumped I-5 through Lane Community College and would have been into the South Hills. That was the direction this fire was taking. And fortunately, Mother Nature took a stop, thankfully, and we were able to go, whoop, let's put a hook on this, and contained it and kept it in the box. That's the term we use in the wildland community. We kept it in the box. But this is the wake-up call. This was the weather event that, if it would have started, and I'll use this as an example, if our ignition source would have been in the Lowell, Dexter area, etc., on that night with those same precipitating factors, we could have very easily been fighting this fire off of Spencer's Butte, off Willamette Street,
Yeah.
Fox Hollow. We could have very easily been into that area. So in my world, as somebody, I've been in public service for 33 years, and my first 20 years was in the military as an aviator. We call this a near miss.
Mhm.
It was unfortunate that it occurred up the Willamette Valley, or I'm sorry, the McKenzie Valley. But I tell you, this is a near miss for those of us in the southern end of the Willamette Valley. And I saw the question in as I'm watching the questions come up on the queue here, and that is, have we decreased our probability of having this event in our community because this happened? And the answer is no, because it burned up in the Willamette Valley, or I'm sorry, the McKenzie Valley. It didn't burn in our area. So you know what? You're right. Those 173,000 acres that burned up there in the McKenzie Valley area, left, right, north, south, etc., those aren't going to burn for years to come because the vegetation's gone. But you know what? At the south end of the Willamette Valley, across the southern end, the northern end, etc., the vegetation is still present. So I think what Tim's trying to express, and I'm gonna back him up on this, is what are we going to do to prevent that piece from happening to us, right? Because I propose that the threat is not diminished for us because it didn't start to the east and burn across the west, because that's our threat, right? That's our threat, folks. It's going to start as an eastern event and burn to the west. Why, Chief? When I get asked that question, it's because that's what history tells us over and over and over and over again. Whether it's the Tillamook fires or whatever fires, etc., that's what history tells us. So how do we prepare for next fire season and let our neighbors know and have that conversation, etc.? And that's why I'm excited to be here tonight.
Thank you, Chief Heppel. Okay, we only have time for a couple more questions and answers. So this one for Deputy Chief Linder. A lot of us are advocating that households, families prepare themselves to be without power and water for weeks, if not in a cascading event, we're anticipating months. And a lot of folks' response to that is to purchase a generator, and so that they can keep their refrigerator going, their freezer, or what have you. And this participant's asking about the fire danger of having a propane tank, even if it's positioned according to code inside the city. Some people are using gasoline generators and storing gasoline. Would you speak to the danger of having those fuels in and around the house and what people can do to minimize that?
Sure, that's a great question, and it's always important to be thinking ahead and preparedness for any type of emergency. And so certainly generators and emergency power is a piece of that. Just like any fuel source, it's balancing that risk. So if you're storing extra fuel and gas cans or spare fuel containers of where those are stored, keeping those away from the property, and thinking ahead in some of those particular areas of what the fuel is around your property can influence around where the propane tank or fuel tank should be. There are code requirements around that, but those are minimum guidelines. So thinking ahead, I can speak back, 15 years ago when I was up in Central Washington, they had actually adopted the wildland code, and we were very proactive in the county I worked for and required propane tanks in wildland areas to be underground so that they were protected a little bit more. We tried to get that adopted into the model code, and we're not successful in that. But there are things that you can think about. So thinking about those kinds of things. If you can get it away farther, maybe put it underground if you're buying the tank versus renting it, providing that protection. But those are good things to be thinking about, and there isn't, unfortunately, a one-size-fits-all answer. They are very situational dependent.
Sure, sure, of course. Well, thank you. That's very helpful. All right, Tim, you get the last one. This is if you can, this is not an easy question, but it's a really good one. So I wanted to make sure it was asked. And so if you can speak to it briefly, and perhaps we can develop some more detailed response and provide that to the participant in writing. So here she's saying that clearly there's this toxic soil and materials that potentially with the winter rains are going to enter the McKenzie River. And she's wondering if there's what kind of policy proposals are out there or that you might recommend to protect flood zones and our water resources from fire debris.
Oh, good question. Well, again, I'm being stretched here a little out of my domain, wildland fire to urban fire. And I would say our highest priority, prevent home ignitions, prevent these community disasters, because unlike what happens in a forest, you know, some of that ash fertilizes soil, enhances the ecosystem. When you talk about burned homes and communities with all that artificial stuff, that's toxic smoke and ash, very hazardous to firefighters and very hazardous to the environment. So I'd rather think on the forward side of that problem, preventing homes from burning down in the first place, versus what do we do afterwards. and I don't know, the example of Paradise, California was a huge hazmat site, and they just had to scrape off all the remains and take them to a sanitary landfill. So I don't know. I am concerned about some of that toxic materials washing right into the McKenzie River, and that's Eugene's municipal water supply.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know what could be done there, but again, you know, doing all we can to prepare for the next fire. This was the equivalent of the big one, okay, for us. And Chief Heppel's right. If it started just a little bit further west, we would have been in the flame zone. As it was, we were already in the smoke zone. So next time we may not be so lucky, but hopefully we'll be better prepared.
Good, thank you. Well, I just want to thank everybody for submitting their questions. My apologies that we didn't get to all of them. We'll try to respond to some of them by via email. And now we need to wrap this thing up, so I'm going to give it back to Tom Peck.
Thank you. This was a very exciting forum. I want, on behalf of the Neighborhood Leaders Council and FAN, I want to thank the speakers, Chief Heppel, Chief Linder, Tim Ingalsbee. This was just incredibly informative, and I can't thank you enough. I want to say to our neighbors and people on this call, we need to listen to what Chief Heppel said. This was a warning shot, and if we don't prepare ourselves, we will suffer. And so I strongly recommend you get involved. Send us an email at firepreventioneugene@gmail.com. We will be holding a meeting of a steering committee and getting our neighborhoods aware and organized. So thank you all for coming. This was a great turnout and a great program. And any last minute statements from anybody else? Well, great. Well, thank you all for attending, and we will keep you informed of our next forum, and be talking soon.
Thank you all.
Thank you much.
Thank you.